Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Her Faith Inspires podcast, where we take cultural issues and we tackle them with biblical truth. I don't know if there's a more cultural issue today that is in the spotlight than abortion, what we'd say reproductive rights. I say that in air quotes because we're going to get into that and what that means and what we're talking about with it. But I have Katie Breckenridge. Let's restart that. I have Catherine Breckenridge, the author of Silent Sorrows, on the podcast. Let's talk about abortion, reproductive technologies, and adoption. She's written this for numerous outlets on beginning and end of life issues, such as The Federalist, Salvo Magazine, National Catholic Register, and Society of St. Sebastian, as well as articles published in the Times UK and the Scotsman through her work as a research associate for the Scottish Council on Human Bioethics. She also works for the children's rights organization Them Before Us and holds a master's degree in mental health and wellness with an emphasis in family dynamics, a graduate certificate in trauma-informed practice, and is working towards a second master's in bioethics. Katie, welcome to the Her Faith Inspires podcast. I'm glad to have you on the show.
Hi, thanks for having me on. It's great to be here.
Yes, you are a well informed guest on this topic, which obviously that's one of the reasons why you write for Salvo. You guys have amazing writers on that team, I'm telling you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, not speaking of myself, but when I read other people's work, I'm like, whew, these are some, powerhouses.
Yeah, and I've had a few of the writers on, and Terrell will tell me like this person, you need to have this person on, you need to have this person on. She told me that I should have you on. And actually I've had Katie Faust from Them Before Us on the podcast a few years ago. It was when she was I think she was just getting started and people were just starting to recognize this children's rights issue. And so I'm thankful that I got to have her on at that time. And we talked about her book and I read that. So you are really supporting some really great causes and ministries out there.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So let's just go ahead and start by since I think my listeners are probably more familiar with Them Before Us and Katie's been on before as well. What work are you doing with something like Them Before Us?
Sure, yeah. Well, if anyone doesn't know, I'm sure most people do know, as you said, but Them Before Us is a children's rights organization that advocates for children's natural rights to their mothers and fathers. So I started working for them back in 2018 because I was very frustrated by the lack of pro-life groups addressing surrogacy, and thankfully Them Before Us was addressing surrogacy and IVF. And I've done a lot for them over the years, a lot of administrative work, but also a lot of research and writing. I know you were telling me you found my articles on the website. Um, and my writing actually began when I was asked to write on surrogacy for a Catholic organization called Society of St. Sebastian, and so I just took off from there. Um, I'll go into a little more background about myself. My interest in these issues started actually when I was in music school, so I wasn't doing anything related to any of this, and this was probably in about 2015. I found a video on it was a traditional surrogate talking about, well, traditional surrogacy is where a woman gets artificially inseminated to conceive her own genetic child for the purpose of giving the child away. And I was so disturbed by this, and I couldn't shake the need to do something about it. And I was thinking, especially from the perspective of the child, like knowing that his or her mother intentionally conceived them for the purpose of feeling no attachment towards them and just giving them to someone else. Like that was the whole purpose of the conception. So what does that do to you? And so I started working extensively in the pro-life movement, and then I got a master's in mental health because I wanted to help children experiencing the side effects of these distorted reproductive situations. And I more recently got a graduate certificate in trauma-informed practice to further understand how trauma impacts children's brains. So I don't do as much anymore with Them Before Us. I am still an editor, But so my book on reproductive technologies was released in May 2015 or 2015, May this past year, and I've started focusing on a little more outside writing outlets and getting my second master's degree in bioethics. And yeah, thankfully, or I guess not really thankfully, but thankfully, there's a lot more to write about now with these topics. We recently heard a lot during this past election. Both sides were championing IVF, and
Mhm.
so there's a lot more to write about now than when I was first getting frustrated about the lack of addressing these issues by pro-life groups.
Yeah, that is interesting because you're right with pro-life. I think people basically tunnel vision that through.
Abortion. Yeah.
Yes, and they don't, and again, for me, I have a little bit of a funny, not funny, haha, but ironic, I guess you could say, because that's kind of where my brain was. My
Hmm.
brain was there, like, oh, you shouldn't, that's a life, don't kill it. And I was raised in the church and we never discussed IVF. Actually, I mean, I've
Yeah.
known lots of people who that's where they go to if they can't, if they're struggling to get pregnant, then everybody's like, oh yeah, yeah, maybe in vitro fertilization. And then you just automatically go there. And it
Yeah,
wasn't
that's
until I
always
went,
the first thing. And
yeah,
that's what reproductive endocrinologists too, that's the first thing that they recommend, not treatments to actually heal the issues. They just go right to IVF.
yeah.
So
And it wasn't
it
until I
goes.
got into apologetics where they talked about the ethics behind fertilizing all of these eggs and putting them in the freezer. And then you're like, oh my gosh, if I'm pro-life and I think life begins at conception, then that means there's a lot of frozen human embryos in these freezers and we're cutting it off at it's not growing in the womb. So what, it has no value
Yeah.
anymore. So yeah,
Yeah.
I love that you guys are broadening this understanding of what it really means to look at human life and to be pro-life.
Yeah.
Very interesting and needed. So when people say that women need access to, we hear reproductive rights, right? Like your reproductive freedoms, your reproductive
Hmm.
rights. And
Heard
we
so
say,
much of that yesterday.
yes. And it's like you hear like, okay, people say, yeah, I mean, I should have the freedom, bodily autonomy. That's all tied to those things, which really are euphemisms to mask what's really behind that message. So what I want to know from you is what are they really saying when you hear things like reproductive rights, reproductive freedoms, bodily autonomy, you have the right to do what you want to do with your body. Why is that language dangerous and why do we have to be aware of it to know what's behind the message?
Yes. So, yeah, we hear this language a lot when it comes to abortion. And what people mean by this is that women have the right, or should have the right, to do what they want with their bodies, which is, yeah, it's a euphemism for being allowed to kill their own children through abortion. This creates apathy towards the fact that, upon fertilization, a unique, unrepeatable human being comes into existence. And so society just had, we, we get so, every time we hear, like, yeah, personal autonomy and choice, it's said in a way that, like, well, of course, like, you don't want to take, like, who actually wants to control other people? Like, and but that's not what's actually happening. So they use this language to disguise what's actually happening. And as Christians, it's vital to acknowledge life at fertilization because otherwise we're denying the incarnation. Really, I mean, not to get too too deep into theology here, but we're denying it by saying that there was a point in Mary's womb where Christ wasn't both God and man, and that's very dangerous.
Mm.
So yes, it's very dangerous. And then we reproductive rights now encompass, as we said, the use of reproductive technologies, um, such as IVF and surrogacy, and they both kill untold numbers of human beings because these practices treat embryos as commodities. And so this isn't about anyone trying to control women's bodies, it's about protecting innocent life.
Mhm. Yeah. No, that's really good. And it's yeah, while you're talking, my I was just thinking a lot about how it's said in such a way, these reproductive rights, reproductive freedoms, when you're like, I wouldn't argue with that.
Yeah,
Well, the right to do what you want with your body. I don't argue with that,
exactly. Like
you
I
know?
don't personally want to control what anybody does. I have my ideals for how I, wish they would act, but
Right.
it's deeper
And
than that.
And some people might even say, well, what do you care specifically if I go and terminate my pregnancy? Because that won't affect how you live. But I think the overall perspective that people miss when they say that is if society as a whole does not value human life, then you can take that thought process if I can do what I want and apply that to any people group with any belief system, with any skin color, like we've done in the past, and say,
Yeah,
well, now I don't value you. And
yeah,
I can do what I want to get rid of you because you don't think the same way as me. Or,
yeah.
so it's like if you follow that to its logical conclusion, it has greater repercussions for society.
You can justify whole groups of people not being human just because you're defining them a certain way, and yeah. So I also think, yeah, and that's how we've gotten to reproductive technologies because it's like, oh, well, we don't, at least with IVF, people view like, oh, it's about creating life. So it's not as bad as abortion. Uh, but it's still like when you don't recognize embryo, when society has a mass view of not recognizing embryos as people, then we can justify, well, it's okay to experiment with them in labs because that's better. We're bringing about life. And yeah, it's just a very slippery slope
Yeah,
when you start humanizing groups of people.
that's a great way to put it. It's a slippery slope. And how
Mhm.
far do we want to go down with that mentality? How far do we want to take that? Because we've seen the repercussions of that throughout history. Uh,
Yeah.
I think the one of the most recent is like Nazi Germany, but also even with the Armenian genocide, and then have that with
Oh,
slavery,
yeah.
and you know,
I actually would like my next book to be about comparing reproductive technologies to past eugenic movements. So I've
mm,
been researching, not lately, but I started researching a little bit of the past movements, and oh my goodness, yeah, there's so much even before
yeah,
the Holocaust we just aren't
right.
aware of. Yeah.
Yeah, the parallels with that would be amazing to see, and that's why I love that you and others are speaking out about this. So, like I said, I mean, IVF, I feel like IVF touches on a whole other emotional type of situation when it comes to this topic because you have women who are crying every month when they cannot get pregnant. You have women that long for a child. So it's almost the flip side, the reverse of this whole abortion issue. Whereas I don't want my child, I'm going to terminate the
Mhm.
life. And now you have, well, that's not the case with IVF. So it's opened up to me a whole new can of worms from what I've seen and conversations that can get heated on social media. But it's also made me, because I wasn't thinking about it like this as a Christian, it made me aware of, oh, wait, I'm thinking about this incorrectly. So what I want to ask you about is, what do we need to, as a Christian, if there's a Christian woman listening to this right now, I'm like, yeah, well, I can't get on board with that. I'm pro-life, but I can't get on board with that. What would you say to them? What do we need to know about IVF that makes this a pro-life issue just as much as the abortion issue is?
Well, since it is so sensitive, I'm going to apologize for my bluntness with this because I'm going to be very blunt. But when you had mentioned abortion forcing a child out of existence if he or she is unwanted. I know Katie often mentions likes to point out that their reproductive technologies and abortion are two sides of the same commodifying coin.
Mhm.
Like one, you can force a child out of existence, but then with reproductive technologies, you're forcing a child into existence, even if it violates their rights. And so, yes, it's a very sensitive topic because, of course, women who have conceived children through IVF, like they don't want to feel, as if their children shouldn't be alive because they were conceived in this manner. They don't want to regret the way that their children came to be. And they shouldn't. I mean, of course, these children are precious and have every right to be alive. I mean, just like children born out of wedlock, do we deny that they're gifts made in God's image because of the circumstances that are of their conceptions? No. But we need to be more cognizant of the amount of children who don't make it because we're taking the creation of life into our own hands. So it is possible to love your children, be grateful for their existence while realizing, okay, this isn't the most moral procedure. Probably shouldn't be condoning this anymore. And I can't imagine the pain that couples experiencing infertility face. I mean, I still don't know if I'm able to have children, but I just got married and I of course have that innate desire to have children with my husband, but we need to stop procedures that treat children as disposable objects as opposed to the unrepeatable, unique persons that they are. And I would certainly, if I were struggling with infertility, I would certainly pursue methods first that which seek to heal the underlying issues of infertility instead of masking them like IVF does.
Hmm.
As I said before, this is IVF is often the first
Yeah.
procedure that's recommended to people. Um, and I've written articles on through the Federalist on these alternatives as well. But yeah, so the IVF process, the procedure mixes sperm and eggs together in a laboratory to create numerous embryonic human beings. And only 2 to 7% of lab created children are born alive. So this is just fraught with the loss of human life. And as Christians, we should be against playing trial and error with human persons like this. Many embryos don't survive the transfer process. They're outright outright disposed of. Um, they don't survive the thawing process. They're donated to research. After retrieval, IVF facilitators routinely prefer having about 10 to 12 mature eggs available with which to work. And so if a woman hopes to have one child, depending on her age, and on average, about 80% of her eggs will fertilize. So if there are 10 eggs, then about 8 of them will fertilize, and between 1/3 to 1/2 of these will actually implant. So how many embryos are created who don't survive, considering like over 8 million children have been born through IVF since 1978.
Mhm.
I had seen an Instagram post, and this is just how just becomes so commonplace. I had seen an Instagram post where a couple had 13 embryos to work with. Someone commented, "Oh, how many embryos do you have?" And she said 13, and they're like, "Oh, that's great," because it ups their chances. And they wanted one more child, and they said that they were going to decide what to do with the rest after their family was complete.
Mhm.
But the reality is that their families, if you have, at least, or if you have any children left over, I mean, they might have had 12 children frozen after this. Um, your families are never complete. You have more children waiting for you. So it's just the sad reality when you create so many children at once. And I know the question often arises from Christians, like, oh, isn't God still in control of who comes into existence through the IVF process? And of course, God is the author of life. He's always in control. Um, but it's through our free will that we pursue IVF and other reproductive technologies, that stand directly opposed to the ideals and truths that God has revealed to us. And, as I said, there are numerous ways in which conception, and as do many other circumstances and conditions, occur outside of the ideals of God's just ordering of creation. And God can turn any decision in the direction of ultimate good, but this doesn't, allow us to make the mistake of believing that when we make distorted decisions, as we all do, me included, I make many, that these decisions are, ordained by God. And there are also Christian clinics that will argue that IVF is permissible if only one egg is extracted and fertilized and implanted. Um, and they just say like, oh, we're just watching God's natural process, and if the embryo doesn't make it, then that's just what happens naturally. They don't make it when they're conceived. They don't all make it when they're conceived naturally. So what's the difference? But even if only one embryo is created and transferred, you're still playing trial and error with that one full human person. So in a way, you're still responsible for the death of that, very bluntly, still responsible for the death of that one human person. Um, and yeah, you're still willing to sacrifice one child in the hopes of achieving, or yes, that one child is still being sacrificed in the hopes of achieving one living child. So
Yeah.
it's just very,
Yeah. I think that it's again, and I know this from my experience. So even those people listening understand that if you don't, if you're barely realizing, oh wait, IVF is fertilizing all these eggs and taking a chance to see which one lives, which one lives and which ones die, because more are
yeah.
going to die than live. Um, and I used to separate that. I think I would say it's a cognitive dissonance, right? You're separating, like, I believe I am pro-life. I believe life begins at conception, but I'm separating that awareness, that understanding, that claim from the scientific fact, not just a moral, the moral absolute, the moral issue of it being life that you've taken into this lab and you've fertilized these two eggs together, or this egg and this sperm, excuse me. We're separating that and saying, but that's okay because we want to have a baby. Because I think that
Hmm.
in many times, the emotions can cloud the logic in it. And
Hmm.
then you override the truth because of what we want and what we desire. And we can do that without truly thinking. We can do that without truly facing it. And I think, Katie, I appreciate, because I do this on my podcast too. Sometimes you just need to say it. I mean, we need to say the thing. Let's not
Hmm.
beat around the bush. Let's understand that if you're in that situation, we can both say that would be tough because we're women. I've had kids. You want to have kids. So we have those, like you said, those natural instincts to mother, to have our own children, to know what it feels like to carry a child in the womb. And there are women who may not ever do that because their bodies, they have something going on, and it's not, but we see women in the Bible who also had those issues. What I love about what you said is, why don't we treat the problem and see what is going on with the body? Because in this culture that we live in as well, we all know that the first thing that doctors will do is, let's throw medicine, or let's throw, some fix, quote unquote, fix at it, rather than diagnose the real problem.
What makes the most money? Like, the reproductive technology industry is a multi-billion dollar industry. So it's definitely a
Right.
money drive.
Yeah. And when you say slippery slope, like, some things are, the first thing is how we're looking at, if we can say it's okay to abort a child, the human life. And even some people even go as far as to try and justify it by saying it's not human, which is complete nonsense. Like, if you're going to say that's not a human life yet until it's born, then we have some major issues with thinking and morality. But if you're going to say, okay, it's okay to do that because it's your body, then again, we have a societal issue that everybody's in danger now, because who is going to deem you as human or not human based upon some arbitrary issue? Okay, put that to the side. But now we're looking at the slippery slope of even IVF of, oh, it's just eggs, it's just sperm, oh, it's coming together. Now we're selling babies to surrogates for two men
Mhm.
who
Yeah,
are, or we're getting for two women who want to have a baby as a couple. They're going and buying some sperm for this child they're bringing into the world, who will never know their father.
yeah, and they're proudly saying, "Oh, my child doesn't have a mom," and, like, as if there's nothing wrong with this, as if there isn't tons of research on the side effects of children not growing up with both their mother and their father.
Yeah.
It's just,
Yeah.
yeah.
So that this is a slippery slope, even if Christians don't hold the line, because human life is rooted, the value is rooted into just the fact that we are created in the image of God. There is nothing you can do to make yourself more valuable. There's nothing you can do to make yourself less valuable. The fact that we are created
Mhm,
in the image of God and we are image bearers
mhm,
is is the fact that makes human life valuable. And if we don't protect that in all areas of this conversation, then we've then it's a weak argument. Then we're not holding fast to what being pro-life really means. And that can
Yeah,
be very dangerous for society.
very, yes.
Yeah. So I don't talk a lot about reproductive technologies. And I think that that is worth talking about right now because you do hear about a lot of
Mhm.
women who struggle to get pregnant. More, I feel like lately, and I don't know if it's because of, the fact that we have a lot more boxed food on the shelf. I mean, we could speculate, right? We could sit there and be like, okay,
Oh,
what is it? It's got to
yes.
be, it's got to be some environmental factors of some sort.
All are genetically modified, and yeah, there, we could go on and on for the
Yeah,
about
and I'm
this
sure we could
probably.
probably read some of your books or articles and find out some more about that. But what is it that you bring to light in regard to the technologies and things that we need to be aware of that may be like trending or coming into this whole cultural movement here?
So there, you seem to be more aware of, I know I've already spoken about the harms of IVF, but there's so much more. So I'm going to go off
Yeah.
on everything else that's involved in this process and get into surrogacy a little bit. So obviously the experimentation and commodification is an issue. We're playing trial and error with countless human lives in hopes of achieving one live birth. But IVF also routinely involves pre-implantation screenings. So these are done to not only determine the likelihood of implantation success, but they screen for chromosomal abnormalities such as Down syndrome, which is again a very slippery slope,
Mm.
um, and inherited genetic anomalies like cystic fibrosis and spinal muscular atrophy. And embryos are often chosen for transfer based on their likelihood of successful implantation. So after the best ones are picked, the they are then transferred. And people, of course, as I said, I mentioned earlier, people justify this by saying that these embryos are the ones that wouldn't have made it naturally anyway, so it's fine. But there's been research that's come out showing that we don't know this for a fact. Researchers have found that embryos with abnormal cells have the ability to self-correct or push out abnormal cells and replace them with normal cells. So we simply don't know which embryos will continue living. And there was a former reproductive embryologist who stated that his name's Dr. Craig Czerzinski. He stated that he has witnessed, like embryos that like by all means shouldn't have implanted and they did, and then ones that were fine and didn't. So we, we're playing trial and error with a lot of lives here when we don't know for a fact if they're going to make it or not. And so if embryos survive these screenings and successfully implant, then they run the risk of being selectively reduced, which is code for killed. Um, which is the selective reduction is the practice of terminating the lives of successfully implanted embryos for reasons such as sex selection or the many complications that arise from multifetal pregnancies like birth defects or premature birth, hypertension, preeclampsia. All the um, multifetal pregnancies are higher in IVF pregnancies because they'll often implant more than one embryo to up the chances of success. And I found this really interesting that eggs, this some research that just came out as well. So eggs will actually choose the sperm that they want to fertilize them through the release of chemical signals, and cervical mucus will also weed out lower quality sperm.
Mm.
So it's interesting to think about like how do these signals change due to fertilization not occurring in its natural environment. Like in a petri dish, how is this? There's no cervical mucus there. Like
Yeah.
how is this working? And we already know that the IVF process exposes eggs and embryos to unnatural environments during the fertilization process. So this unnatural environment can impact cellular processes and alter chromosome structure, the transcription of DNA, and embryonic development, which can lead to different types of physical and intellectual disabilities. So, knowing that eggs will choose sperm naturally, um, I found it really interesting that those, not just those conceived through the regular petri dish fertilization process, but there's a process used in IVF sometimes too called intracytoplasmic sperm injection, where a sperm is directly injected into an egg. So these eggs really have no choice in the matter.
Mm.
And the physical and intellectual disabilities are higher in children conceived through this procedure. So I was like, that's definitely a connection there then. If we're
Right.
um, if the eggs aren't getting to choose which sperm is best for, that they want them to fertilize them. So there's so much, bear with me. Out of and through IVF we get surrogacy, which is often viewed as a self-sacrificial way, to help others have children. We often hear like, oh, well, they're just carrying the child instead of the mother and they're just giving the child back to its parents. But this is just not, it's not reality. What we know about how the child bonds in the womb and the deeper connection between mother and child, like it's not simply, you're not simply babysitting. So surrogacy interjects a third person into the marriage union, intentionally separates pregnancy from motherhood, and it suggests to the world that pregnancy is nothing more than incubation. But the bond between mother and child is so much more than incubation. Um, but when pregnancy is reduced to anything less than the special moment of the beginning of motherhood and is instead reduced to a means to get what we want, the door is open to, manipulate and exploit women and children in whatever ways we'd like. So surrogacy treats human conception as a business transaction and allows women to use one of the most intimate realities of their body for someone else's personal gain. And they often refer to themselves as, like ovens and babysitters. I saw a surrogate recently refer to the child she was carrying as her belly buddy. And so while surrogates often view themselves or are made by agencies to view themselves as simply ovens and babysitters, um, these babies, they are their mothers.
Mm-hmm.
Um, we already know, we talk a lot about this at them before us. We already know that adoptees can suffer what's referred to as a primal wound, and since like neurological events which occur during infancy can have long-term impacts on relational and emotional functioning. I talk about this a lot in my the adoption chapter of my book. Because I want to shed light on, while adoption can be very life-saving, we need to be more aware of the trauma that's often involved in it as well and try to avoid this at all costs. And it shouldn't, just be about, oh, I can't have children. I really want a baby, so I'm going to, um, try to get matched with a pregnant mother and like, instead of helping her to keep her child, just,
Yeah.
get the child for myself. We should not be doing this. And
Yeah.
there are also adoption agencies that will offer scholarships to pregnant women who decide to place their babies, which is very coercive and
Yes, it is.
um so yeah, studies show that maternal separation is a major stressor for the infant and can permanently alter infants' brains. A lot of adoptees will say that they suffer from mental health issues like depression, abandonment, loss issues, issues with intimacy. And I just want to read a few quotes because I think they really drive the point. So Nancy Verrier, you may have heard of her. She's the author of Primal Wound, and she's also an adopted mom and psychotherapist. But she wrote about primal wound. The primal wound occurs when a postnatal separation from the biological mother imprints the infant with a sense of abandonment and loss. The 9-month bond with the biological mother, her smell, feel, taste, and sound are all gone. The loss of the child's primordial loving, caring, and protective relationship can be indelibly imprinted on the unconscious mind as a traumatic injury. And there's another researcher, Dr. Catherine Lynch, who is also an adoptee, who stated that human studies with infants and children, as well as animal studies, have shown that adverse early infant experiences can lead to short-term neurobehavioral and neurohormonal changes in offspring that may have long-term adverse effects on memory, learning, and behavior throughout life. So in this way, early separation trauma is biologically embedded, influencing learning, behavior, and health for decades to come, and perhaps beyond, as research in epigenetics has shown that stress in infancy can have intergenerational impacts on gene transcription. So this trauma can pass on to future generations as well. And so I think it's also important to think about, since babies are biologically wired to recognize their mother's sense at birth, they recognize their mother's touch, they recognize her voice, and they're comforted by this. Not only are surrogate babies denied this comfort, but since they can suffer attachment trauma through this separation, like how does this change their emotional development? Like there are several studies showing how attachment impacts development, and babies learn emotional intelligence and how to interact through facial expressions, and their mothers are the ones they look to first for everything. So how do they learn? By looking at their non-birth mother's faces when they're struggling, with abandonment trauma and don't have a secure sense of attachment. I find that very interesting, something we need to be more aware of.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I've heard recently too, and a lot more. And I wish I was more aware of this when I was pregnant with my own boys, because it's just really, really neat, that bond between mother and child, how it's
Mm,
happening while they're developing in the womb. And I did hear when I was pregnant with them, like you can sing to them, you could read them stories, that kind of thing. And my husband would kind of like, talk to them and stuff sometimes. But the smells, like they know what you smell like, and only one of my boys was super attached to me and my husband. He
mhm.
was attached to my husband too, which I find to be odd, because as long as one of us was holding him, he wouldn't cry. But
Huh.
the other two were comforted by me. I could tell when they wanted mom, but they were very social, so they didn't mind going to people, but they would also,
Mhm.
just like when they're tired, they wanted mom. But my youngest, he could just tell when I was holding him. And I would be like, how does this kid know? But I later on, now looking at all the scientific research and evidence of, they know your smell. Of course, they know your voice. Um, they know how you hold them. Like I think kids could tell. I knew how my boys wanted to be held. So you hold
Mhm.
them that certain way. And if somebody else wasn't holding them, like if you hold him this way, he'll fall asleep. And I think they could just tell when mom was putting them in that position. And it's so true. It's just really neat to see that. And I just think, how in the world does a newborn baby, because we don't remember when we were babies and our moms held us and their
No,
sound of their voices. So we think they won't remember. This isn't affecting
they're
them.
just blank slates. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Their minds are still developing. They're still trying to
Um,
get to know who we are. But I remember one of my boys at 4 months old, he would cry every night, and there's that stage where some babies will just do that colicky, whatever the reason. But here we go. We hit 7 p.m. He starts crying, and a friend was over at the house and she had him and she was just holding him. And I didn't think anything of it. And I walked over and I'm like, it's all right. And he turns his head, looks over at me like, and he's still crying. But she's like, oh my gosh, like he would recognize your voice and he looked your direction and wants you to hold him. And at that time, he was just a few
mhm.
months old and he couldn't reach for me yet or anything. But I saw him and I'm like, oh my gosh. And I was thinking, he's a little fussy. It doesn't matter who's holding him as long as,
Mhm.
and he was just like, no, I want my mom. And it's so true. And I never thought about the repercussions of tearing a baby away from that smell, away from that voice, away from that touch. And it's what I find also odd is that on one hand, women want to talk about how we need to be valued, how we need in society, we need to see how important we are, how much we contribute, but then we devalue our roles by
Yeah.
making it a oven or making ourselves a babysitter to carry
Mhm.
another human life and just pass it on.
And how many times do you see people like yesterday I saw too a lot of people putting profile pictures up of like The Handmaid's Tale.
Yeah.
And I'm like, but you're letting so on one hand you want equality, not to be treated like incubators, even though that's not what regular pregnancy is. And um, but then you're endorsing women being used for their reproductive abilities and
Yeah. And
handing
telling
their
and
children
telling
over.
yes,
Yeah,
and telling
trafficking their children. Yeah.
exactly. Even to the point of telling a biological man, you can slap on some heels, put on a dress, wear some fake boobs and some makeup, and you can call yourself me, and we'll stop calling ourselves women and call ourselves birthing persons.
I find that so insulting whenever I
Yeah.
see men dressed like women. I'm like, you have no idea what it's like to be in like it's
No, even the whole cycle of, and I take this back to when, people have asked me before when God told Eve, you'll have and pain in childbearing. And
Mhm.
people would be like, well, what about the women who can't bear a child? Well, guess what? Every time you experience that monthly cycle where you have cramps or you're having to just deal with the fact that, oh, I have to go to work today. I need to prepare
Yeah.
myself for when I have to run to the restroom or whatever. That's part of that experience. That is part of being a woman that God has created. That's part of being a reflection of Eve as the
Mhm.
women in that line of descendants, which is all of us. And a man does not know that, and he never will.
And even if you're a woman who doesn't experience those, if you had a hysterectomy or something, you're like, oh well, I don't experience this, so that doesn't make me want it's still you're if you weren't facing these difficulties, you're still a biological woman. Like
Yeah.
you would still be undergoing these if you weren't struggling with these
Right.
so it's yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and I would argue even on that side, let's say you don't have a cycle anymore. You had a hysterectomy or whatever, but you still have the effects of not having those hormones, your body
Yeah,
replenishing those hormones like they should because you are a woman.
exactly.
So
Yes.
everything leads back to the fact because I am a woman, this is the effect, this is the result. And I don't care what you want to claim. If God made you a man and you're trying to act within a woman's role, it will never fit. And when we allow that, when we pretend that that's a reality, we are saying the message of women are valued. Well, guess what? You have just contradicted that message. When you say a woman should be heard, a woman should be valued for her role in society, when you say anybody can take on this role,
Yeah,
then
you're
you've devalued your
diminishing
position. Yes,
exactly. Isn't
exactly.
that's what J.K. Rowling is getting in trouble for a
Yeah.
lot, isn't saying that?
Crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
it's funny because she's a feminist and I'm definitely not a feminist, but I don't think you have to be a feminist to
Acknowledge
value.
reality. Yeah.
Exactly. To acknowledge reality, to acknowledge the value in women, to acknowledge that that motherhood, that is such a special thing that God has given the task to us. And I don't have to be a feminist to champion that because God has already done it. God has already
Mhm.
laid value and placed value on that no title, no organization, no movement can make any greater. We just have to say, that's a great thing. And I'll speak that truth because the truth in it is enough to make people say, yeah,
And
that's
speak for
that's really
itself.
what we need.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Speaks for itself. So I wanted to ask you, how do we, these are sensitive topics um and they're hard. They could be heated debates because again, we've acknowledged that there's emotion in them because there's pain in them. And when there's pain in it, people sometimes are tempted to tweak the truth or to not speak the truth. Like you said, I'm just going to lay it out and I'm going to acknowledge that it's
Mhm.
hard, but I'm going to lay it out, which I appreciate. I think we need to have more conversations that acknowledge the hard, but still the reality. How do we address the euphemisms? How do we talk about the reproductive rights, the IVF? Um, especially surrounding, it's going to be a conversation that's not going to go away because the election's over. It's still going to be in the forefront because, I mean, all of these states, now it's back into the hands of the states, the abortion issue, the pro-life issue. So it's being talked about. How do we handle it?
Yeah, so it is tough because who, a lot of people who champion abortion don't want to hear, they don't care if life begins at conception. They're just focused on bodily autonomy. So well, first, going back to IVF, I think a lot of people are just simply unaware of what really goes on with the procedure. So we need to respectfully educate them on what actually goes on and the alternatives. But I think so. I realized this in my own life a lot because I've made a lot of stupid mistakes with guys in the past. And I've realized getting married how meaningful it really is to have a guy who appreciates and honors your dignity. And because, so we live in a society that's women women need more respect for themselves and their own dignity, as in don't sleep with men, preferably before marriage, but don't sleep with men who use you. Don't sleep with guys who you wouldn't want to risk pregnancy with. Have respect for yourself and your miraculous ability to create whole new human beings. Like, this is incredible. Women are capable of creating unique persons who will never exist again, who are born to them specifically in a specific time, a specific place. Like, this is really, it's amazing. It's a miracle. And so we have a culture that pushes for gratification at all costs. And unfortunately, men use this to their advantage and they use women, for sex because they let them. And I'm speaking from my own experience here too. I know how stupid this is. And I'm putting the blame on both sides here. Because we really should have learned by now the consequences of premarital sex and how divorce and children not having both their mother and their father in their lives is harmful to them. So not only are we reducing the dignity of both men and women, but the consequences of familial breakdown are harming children. And there's a plethora of evidence for this.
Right.
So we need to wake up and we need to continue to bring awareness to how all of society is affected by this, and specifically children. I
Mhm.
mean, we know this though, like, and it's hard. I'm like, where's the disconnect? Because we know that children, when their parents are going through divorce, we know how hard it is for them. I witness this at work all the time when children are acting out, and I I'll ask. Well, usually it's a child I'm not as familiar with yet. And I'll ask my coworkers, like, are his or her parents still together? And they're like, oh no. And I'm like, yeah, I can tell. Like, we have so much research on this. So
Yeah.
we just need to stop putting our own wants and desires first and realize the consequences that our actions have on other people.
Yeah. I think you're right. And I think there's
And
something to be said for you to say, I think we do become different from when we're single to when we're married and then to when we're mothers, because when you get married, now all of a sudden you're living life with somebody. When you become a mom, you're living life for somebody.
Mhm,
And motherhood, like for me, and I'll speak for myself, I literally feel like I have three boys who are
mhm.
extensions of my very own heart. Like when
Yeah,
they hurt, I hurt. When they celebrate a success, I feel like it's my own success
and they
because
are. You have an eternal relationship with them. So,
exactly. And I think that's one thing when you nailed it with self gratification. We do not have delayed gratification. We're not thinking for somebody else. And when you do get married, you're like, "Oh wait, every decision I make, I'm making it with a partner. I have somebody with me who's doing this life with me." But when you live for your children, when you're doing things because of them, then everything's different. It's like, should we stay in the state? Should we move across the country? Do we send them to this school? Do we pick this neighborhood? What's it going to look like for my
Mhm.
family, for my kids? And I love what Katie said. She, especially when it's referring to divorce, she had said, people will use the excuse, well, I'm doing it for the kids because we're always fighting. And she's like, no, 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 no. You stay together and you fight each other till you die because that's what's really for the kids. And we can justify it and be like, oh, it's really for somebody else. It's really not. Whenever we do
Yeah.
the easy thing, which we think is hard, but we're doing the easier thing out of the two hard things, we're still doing it because for us, it's easier.
Yeah, there's a student that I work with now whose parents got divorced recently, and she was talking about how her parents used to fight all the time. She's like, yeah, my parents used to fight all the time, but now I get two Christmases and two Thanksgivings. I'm like, they're just, I know she's not actually happy about it, but that's what she's told. Like, oh, you get two of everything now, so you should
Right.
be happy.
Right. Yeah, and that's the thing is that we're really good. I mean, I think all of us as human beings, we are good at masking things with our own justifications of doing it
Mhm.
our way.
We're good at
And
convincing ourselves that
yeah,
we feel a certain way when we
and
really
I think we
don't.
need to look at that and say, is this confirmation bias? Am I just looking at things to confirm the decision that I made to make me feel better about it?
Mhm.
And being honest, or is this really something that benefits my family? Because again, when you have kids, it's not just what's good for me. Maybe when your kids are adults and they've moved out and you're like, okay, I have this time. Now what do I want to
Yeah.
do? But not when they are at home and you're raising them because their minds are being formed and molded. And we don't often think about the emotional side of it. So I'm really excited when you get your, what are the effects, the traumatic effects of this in children. That to me is going to be educational as well. So I'm really happy
Yeah.
that there's people like you and Katie and others going deeper into these issues.
Mhm. I'm
Mm.
thankful for people like you who are willing to have us speak about it.
Well, yeah, it's easy when you guys are so well versed in it. Where can we find you in some of the work that you've done? I know you wrote a book on it. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes. So my book can be, the main outlet for that would be Amazon. You can find that on Amazon, and it's called Silent Sorrows. And I talk about it. I kind of wanted it to be more like a resource, like a reference guide, because I talk about arguments about abortion, the common arguments, I address those. And then I have a section on mothers and fathers. I have a section, or the importance of mothers and fathers. I have a section, I talk a lot about a donor conception in that one. And I have a section on IVF, on surrogacy, and then I have a chapter addressing these issues from a strictly Christian perspective as well. Um, Mostly Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox, but and it's my hope that all Christians can find truth in this. And I also have an adoption section, like mentioned a bit before, to shed light on. I have a lot of testimonies from adoptees and birth mothers
Hmm.
in there. And I unfortunately found that a lot of adoptees are pro-choice, and so some of them were not very thrilled with being included in my book. And so I was like, oh, it's just a little disheartening. So I'm like, okay, but I'm trying to bring awareness to the trauma that you're facing. And a lot of them have, there's one Instagram account called Adoptee Reclaimed that I follow a lot. And I think she's very good with getting across the impacts of, like how often they're told like, oh, you should be grateful that you're adopted and you're you were chosen. And she's like, okay, like you can be, no, I mean, a lot of them say like, of course I love my adoptive parents, but you're not listening here, like about the impacts of this. So that's what I wanted to shed more light on, and how we shouldn't just jump in to, um, as I said before, just adopting children without making sure that there's absolutely no reunification of any family members possible, because that's where they naturally belong with their biological family. So I feel like a lot of people so far it's been the most controversial chapter because they think I'm totally against adoption, which is not the case. I know it can be life-saving, but I'm just trying to bring awareness to
Right.
the
I-
pain
yeah.
involved as well. And Yeah, so that's what my book's about. That can be found. It's also on, I believe, Walmart and Google Play. It's all over. If you
Okay.
search, have to search Catherine though. It's under Catherine Breckenridge.
Okay.
And yeah, and you can also find all. I have all my articles on Substack, and a lot of my articles can be found on the Federalist, Salvo magazine, them before us, of course. Written for National Catholic Register, a lot on Society of Saint Sebastian, and is there Angelus News as well. Yeah, those are the main ones.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's great. Well, we have lots of resources for continuing the education on this topic and just children, the children's rights issue of their biological parents and what it looks like to when they don't have that, I guess. So I'm thankful that you are speaking on this topic. I'm thankful that you came on today. I'll make sure I put all the links for you in the show notes as well. So Katie, thanks so much for joining us today. Again, I appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you so much again.
All right, guys. So again, I'm going to put all the links in the show notes. If you have any questions for me, you can email me at hello@shandafulbright.com. Again, if you want to continue the education in this so you know how to have these conversations because they're being had right now, we need to know how to tackle them with grace, but also with knowledge. If we need to be educated, like I said, I needed that. How much more others in the church? So let's know what we're talking about from people who have prepared this information from us. Go to the link in the show notes. All of them will be listed there. And again, if you have any questions for me, you can email me and I'll catch you on the next one.